Okay, I think we can get started. As you most all know, my name is Gregory Conley. I serve as the president of the American Vaping Association, which is a nonprofit that advocates for sensible policies towards vaping products with the end goal of maximizing the number of adult smokers who use these products to get off cigarettes. And this is a webinar on commenting on the USPS vape mail restrictions. These restrictions were passed through Congress at the end of December, and there is a public comment period that is going on right now. And so I want to hand over the floor to my good friend, Paul Blair. Paul used to be at Americans for Tax Reform. They were one of the earliest NGOs really fighting back against taxes on vaping products. And he is now the VP of Government Affairs at Turning Point Brands. It was his idea. Maybe we should do a webinar. So I'm going to allow him to host. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Greg. I don't know if it's just on my screen or if everyone has like 3 pictures of me, including my colleague, Brittany. At some point, we might be able to figure that out. But I appreciate everyone for tuning in today. For a bit of additional introductions, my name is Paul Blair. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs at Turning Point Brands. We are a Kentucky-based company that is engaged in sale of a broad range of consumer products, including ends, which is the subject of conversations today. Obviously, Greg's already introduced himself. I'll defer some of the other introductions as well. But for those who may not know, you've also got Alex Clark, who runs the Consumer Advocates for Smoke-Free Alternatives Association on this webinar, who's going to touch a bit on consumer interest here and how beyond business engagement with USPS, where there's a role for consumers to voice their concerns generally. And again, as a business owner, you may also be a consumer. So certainly there's a dual effect of that opportunity. And then finally, we've also got Michael Scanlon, who's a practice area leader, policy and regulatory at K&L Gates, Washington, DC based law firm that's done quite a bit of work in this space as well. And I'll have him do additional introductions on this as we sort of talk about rulemaking itself. Broadly, I hope that we have plenty of time for Q&A, and so I'll keep my remarks relatively brief. But going over a little bit again about the intent of this webinar, this is broadly sort of an education effort and an opportunity to answer some of the questions that have arisen from a number of businesses in this space regarding implementation of the new PACT Act as it relates to ends and how Congress has sort of newly defined what ends are, as well as the scope of issues being contemplated by USPS during this process. Some of the things that we're going to touch on today, including are going to include, business to consumer limitations on the shipment of e-cigarettes, vapor products, and ends, as well as potential business to business limitations that exist both in the private sector. Some of you have probably had some ongoing conversations with common carriers or those firms that you use to ship and receive products, but obviously most specifically USPS and what they're contemplating, what Congress has required them to look at, examine, and limit, and what processes might exist that are both open to interpretation, some set in law, but mostly important as part of this conversation, where you as a business may be able to provide some input to USPS that'll help them before they implement a final rule, in the coming weeks. I know that it was on the original invitation, but just for clarity purposes, comments are due March 22nd. So for anyone, whether you're a business or a consumer or both, that has an interest in engaging with USPS and sharing your perspective on the rule as released, those comments have to be in by March 22nd. It's a relatively easy process. I know we'll talk about what that process looks like later in this webinar, but worth noting that is the deadlines. To Greg's point as well, we're not going to have specific compliance advice for folks on the webinar. You have to consult both the guidance that USPS ultimately releases, but potentially lawyers and compliance regulatory folks as well. And some of this stuff is up in the air. So even if we could give you advice, it may not all be there at this point because we still have to wait for some of these rules to be made final. Again, some of the requirements that are new are registration requirements for businesses in this space. This has changed a lot in recent years, but ultimately there are still requirements that every business engaged in the shipment or receiving vapor products and ends has to be registered. Some of those are outlined by Congress. Some of them will be outlined by USPS. Some of them date back 10 years, some of them date back longer than that. And so I'm not going to touch too much on that, but in general, worth knowing that you have to be a registered business to be in compliance with the new PACT Act. And part of the USPS rulemaking process and part of potentially shipping or receiving products carried by USPS will require a demonstration of registration with appropriate state authorities and the feds. And so that's perhaps new to some folks. Certainly, if you're a manufacturer or if you'd followed PMTA issues, it's a whole new set of hoops that folks might have to jump through if you're not already there and operating in all 50 states. But sort of important to understand as part of the rulemaking process that is a requirement. It's a requirement that USPS can't change. It's one that's in law. It's one that Congress mandates. And so certainly as you look for compliance advice, whether in-house or externally, just be aware of that. Before I hand it off, I do want to stress how important it is that USPS hears from businesses. One of the unique elements of this industry, those that are subject to limitations or regulations for ends, is that for federal rulemakers, some of this stuff is new. Certainly, the Center for Tobacco Products and the Food and Drug Administration isn't new to attempting to figure out the scope of this industry and the type of products that exist and how to regulate them. But this is a new agency that may be grappling with some of the restrictions that they've been tasked with implementing that may be above certainly their breadth of experience or knowledge. And so part of this process and where there's an opportunity for businesses is getting on the record and sharing with a new regulator, a new agency, your business model as it relates to shipping, handling, receiving these products. And so again, that's whether you're a business or a consumer. A lot of this information is informative and helpful because as we'll talk about, some of the issues that USPS is looking into addressing, they've left open to suggest that it is a unique market, that when compared to cigarettes or smokeless tobacco, the sort of products that were limited by the original PACT Act in 2010, they're unique products. A pack of cigarettes is a lot different than the 500 different types or 5,000, or I think we had one applicant, according to the FDA, that submitted 4+ million different PMTAs. And so it's a lot different than the scope of products and the diversity of products that federal regulators generally deal with. And so they've left open some of these questions on things like consumer testing or figuring out if there's a product standard that would make registration for them easier. And so as we talk about towards perhaps the end of this webinar, your opportunity to engage with the USPS, that sort of information about your business and the products that you ship and handle and sell will be helpful for them. This is something that'll be on the record for the government, not in a legal sense, but for the government. And so having that sort of diversity of understanding of the market is something that will be helpful. Before I hand it off, I'll just say that again, hopefully this is an informative process about what USPS is currently contemplating. There may be questions that we don't get to throughout this webinar. Some of them might be legal in nature that we can't get to, but if there are questions about the process itself, I know that Greg is certainly volunteered to be helpful in terms of giving businesses advice on what they might need to include in their submission of comments to the agency. And certainly part of this webinar hopes to limit the number of phone calls, conversations, emails that those who have volunteered to help here may have to answer. But if there are outstanding questions, hopefully between AVA, CASA, and maybe if I can to some extent too, we're able to answer some of those either today or before the deadline on March 22nd. So I've kind of given a broad overview of what we're going to talk about today or what we're not going to talk about today. But let's take a little more, I want to take a little bit more of a granular approach to how we got here in terms of what Congress has mandated the USPS to do, what USPS has at least broadly outlined as their objectives and intent for implementing the new PACT Act, and sort of what the scope of USPS considerations are during this public comment period. And so for that, I'm going to first turn it over to Michael Scanlon at K&L Gates, who is working on this with us and can share sort of the legal perspective on what Congress has been mandated USPS to do, what the scope of rulemaking is, and where things stand potentially in terms of some of these outstanding questions. So I'll hand it over to Michael for that.
Great. Thanks, Paul, very much. I'm happy to speak for a couple moments just about the background on the new PACT Act, the original PACT Act, and the Postal Service's involvement there. I can talk to the Postal Service's role in the pending rulemaking, and then also talk about what I think are both some short-term and longer-term objectives in terms of, which I know Greg and others are going to get into, in terms of comments that could be helpful in the context of the current rule, but also I think laying a foundation for what may be the need for future legislative changes. Just by way of background, what we're talking about in the rulemaking the Postal Service is currently undertaking is trying to implement mailability provisions of what's called the new PACT Act, which basically amends the existing provisions in the PACT Act that was passed back in 2009 by including, under the definition of cigarettes in the Jenkins Act, electronic nicotine delivery systems ends. And I think one of the issues, recurrent issue that will come up in this call, that many of you have probably already noticed, is the fact that the definition of ends that was included in the new PACT Act is very expansive. And I think so expansive, in fact, that I think the Postal Service is struggling with it a little bit in terms of how to implement these mailability provisions. And I think, as Paul noted, it kind of drags in with it a whole other set of implications. It's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog here in terms of mailability provisions opening up a whole new constellation of products now being subject to the Jenkins Act and what was the pre-existing regime. So by way of history, the PACT Act, and I think this history is helpful in terms of thinking about how to approach the current rulemaking. It certainly is from the Postal Service's perspective, because they've been at it now for 10 plus years with the PACT Act. The history there is that the PACT Act really was targeting illegal trafficking in cigarette sales and illegal sales to minors, specifically remote sales through internet sellers to minors. And a significant part of that was trying to get at tax evasion through some of these products, which, after a series of hearings and a series of bills over several years, including support of, at the time, many of the mainstream tobacco industry, because of the fact that this illegal trafficking and the illegal sales were harmful not only in terms of the policy goals, tax evasion, and sales to minors that the Congress was trying to prevent, but a big part of the bill was actually trying to protect legitimate businesses in the tobacco industry. And that's important to note, because I think it informs kind of the whole discussion around what's permissible and what's not permissible, and really what this is targeting and what's excluded from it. What it was targeting, again, it made a clear distinction between remote sellers and essentially legitimate retail sales that could be age verified in-person sales to consenting adults. And for that reason, one of the things Congress talked about is really trying to isolate these illegal sellers by creating this closed system of legitimate businesses that could ship to each other under this B2B exception to the general mailability prohibition that were supposed to be protected by this. And so, in a sense, legitimate tobacco businesses were very much within kind of the zone of interest that Congress wanted to protect, as was tax collection and youth protection in terms of preventing illegal sales. And I think the Postal Service did a good job 10 years ago. Again, the same setup where once Congress passed the bill, although with more deliberation going into the original PACT Act, the Postal Service was then charged within a very short period to implement regulations that provided exceptions to the general rule that the Postal Service could no longer carry tobacco products. They were no longer mailable in the language the Postal Service uses. And the reason this needed to be done through legislation is the Postal Service by statute is a common carrier. And so even though the New York Attorney General and others could prosecute and achieve settlements with some of the major private carriers, the Postal Service couldn't turn away packages unless Congress limited its ability to carry them. And so that was really the background in terms of the original PACT Act. The Postal Service did promulgate regs in 2009 for the purpose, again, of generally prohibiting the sales of tobacco, direct remote sales to consumers, while at the same time including one of the important exceptions which survives, which is called the business shipments or regulatory shipments exception. And that basically says that legitimate businesses, manufacturers, distributors, others in the supply chain for the sale of legitimate tobacco products in face-to-face retail transactions, those shipments are permitted to continue. And the Postal Service has interpreted that way for over 10 years. There's a field guide that instructs its personnel in terms of how to handle that fleshes out some of the detail that's useful. But over time, all these postal regs have been put into what's called Publication 52, which is a postal publication on permissible shipments of certain materials. And that is incorporated by reference into the CFR. So it does have the effect of law. What's interesting there is most of the PACT Act was very prescriptive in terms of requirements postal need to make in terms of labeling, reporting, verification, and so forth. And you see a lot of that come through the regs, where the Postal Service is now, in some respects, forced in terms of applying certain provisions that are just carryover provisions right from the statute. It doesn't have a lot of latitude to do that. I think that's something worth bearing in mind as people think about comments. In this case, the new PACT Act was developed much more quickly, some would say hastily, by Congress at the end of last year. It was attached to the omnibus, passed at the end of December. And like the predecessor a decade ago, the Postal Service was given only 120 days to implement regulations that put into force the exceptions to the general statutory rule that all now ends products, in addition to tobacco products, are no longer mailable. I think as you look through the proposed rule the Postal Service has put out, it's very clear that they're also struggling, I think, with how expansive that definition is, that it isn't exactly a one-to-one carryover, and what it means. I think from a positive standpoint, with the Postal Service, the approach they're taking is that, as they have for over a decade, what they're saying is we want to make sure we have a clear path for legitimate businesses to engage in shipments among businesses. We can talk about how that verification and application process can be improved. I assume that's something that others will talk about and will likely be part of many of the comments that are filed. But I think one of the things that is important from businesses in the vape industry is to make sure that you're supporting that aspect of the rule, that of course the business-to-business exception should continue in parallel for ends products, just as it always has for tobacco products. And it's clear from both, I think, the structure and the brevity of the new PACT Act that Congress didn't intend any deviation from that. It's been the existing practice for over a decade, and it's a critical piece to continue. So I think part of the comments, I think, are supporting and making the point that, of course, legitimate shipments among legitimate businesses now in the ends space, in addition to covered tobacco products, Congress always intended to protect those, and the Postal Service should continue to permit them. It's really a question of how to improve the process for what are now a whole new universe of many small businesses now tied into this, in terms of how to ease the administrative burden on those businesses, and also from the Postal Service's own standpoint, if there's a way to improve that application and verification procedure to minimize the burden on postal workers as well. I would just say the other piece to this is, I think there's two things to come out of this. One is, I think it's helpful to have the Postal Service reaffirm that legitimate businesses selling ends products or distributing ends products or manufacturing ends products can continue to ship between businesses, also for regulatory purposes, and to the extent you're a manufacturer, for consumer testing purposes. But also, I think the comments should be geared toward having the Postal Service acknowledge, as it has in the proposed rule, but I think it would be helpful in the final rule to say in the final rule that while there is an imperfect match for a lot of these pieces, that the expansive definition of ends that Congress put in place does create some real challenges and some unintended consequences. And I think it shouldn't be that hard to get the Postal Service to say that. I think that's clearly where its head's at based on the proposed rule. I think that could be an important foundation in the future as the associations think about legislative strategies to try to pare back or refine the definition that Congress put in place to mitigate against any unintended consequences. The last piece I'll just say, and Paul mentioned it in terms of the Postal Service's role, they really are a functionary here and a pass-through. So I think comments that invite the Postal Service to revisit or rewrite the statutory language that Congress put in place, they're not empowered to do that by law. And so that's probably not the best use of time. I think the Postal Service does ask a number of specific questions. They raise 4 specific areas where they invite comments in particular. One is on the kind of terminology they're using in terms of defining ends products as, quote, tobacco products, end quote, for purposes of the rule. Another is with respect to whether any of the existing exceptions should be treated differently because it's ends products rather than cigarettes. Again, that's one where I think it is helpful for commenters to say, certainly with respect to the business shipments exception, that should be carried forward, and that was Congress's intent. There's another question on reasonable cause, which I don't think has great relevance to this group necessarily. And there's a final on consumer testing, which is probably more limited, really relevant, I think, for manufacturers more than others. I do think it's worth certainly being responsive to those questions in a short comments that are responsive to that. And as Paul mentioned, perhaps most importantly, the deadline for filing is March 22nd. So, I think a large set of short comments from business owners that talk about the potential impact and burden on their business would be really helpful. The comments have to be filed timely to be considered by the Postal Service under the APA, so just make sure you make the deadline. And with that, I'll turn it back over, Paul. If there's any specific questions, I'm happy to address them.
Sure, appreciate it. I think we'll save most of the Q&A towards the end. And as I facilitate the conversation, I'll hand it back to Greg, who touch on sort of the specific business role here in providing sort of commentary and concise comments to USPS as part of this process. So, Greg.
Thank you, Paul. And I do believe that what we've seen the past 2 months with UPS and FedEx should absolutely be part of your rule, part of your comment, as I'm going to explain. Let me share my screen. There we go. So there are about 4 distinct points that I would refer you to when you're making your comments. Not sure why the subtitles are down at the bottom so that you can test how accurate they are versus what I talk about as a fun game during this. But 4 big points. The first one, anyone who has looked into the business to business exception process at the USPS sees that this is a system that was designed 10 plus years ago. This is not, the post office has wanted to strive over the last decade to digitize, to modernize. Well, what they are existing with, the old system, is not useful, and it's going to either cause huge delays in paperwork being processed once the rule goes into effect, or they're going to have to hire or divert a whole lot of resources to handle all of these licenses, all of these requests, all of these questions. So we want to recommend streamlining, digitizing, and simplifying the B2B exception process. This is the government, so we do not expect that your comment comes in on March 22nd, and by the time April 1st comes along and the rule is published, who knows what the date of the final rule being published is, that's theoretical, but April 1st, April 10th comes along, there's not going to be a digital site pop up that quickly, but a large amount of comments talking about the need for this could cause them to work on it and make it faster than you would expect. The second is, as Michael noted, push them to acknowledge that the PACT Act and congressional intent was to limit USPS B2C sales, business to consumer, not business to business. The business purposes exception should include the natural process of a distributor and or a manufacturer shipping to retailers. And this is especially true in the current environment with FedEx and UPS deciding that even for B2B transactions, they don't want to be involved. The third, reform the current exemption for B2B sales. As one vendor in Kentucky last week posted that he looked into exactly how much it would cost to go by what is in the USPS PACT Act field information kit today. That indicates you need to drop off the package in person, and you need to ship the product using express mail hold for pickup service. That is a massive cost and a big headache for both the the retailer, the receiver, and the various postal employees that are going to have to go through this. Congress did not say that express mail hold for pickup service must be used for every business to business transaction. And USPS, before vaping products came along, I don't think, and Michael maybe during the Q&A can address this, I don't think that the USPS in the past 10 years has been being used very frequently for cigarette and smokeless tobacco sales. They haven't really had to think hard about this. This is their opportunity. And the fourth, you all have great stories. if you're a manufacturer, you hear from customers that say your product has helped them. If you are a shop owner concerned about your access to help your consumers gain access to vaping products, those are stories that need to be told. The post office, through the actual proposed rule, you can see this is not a faceless bureaucratic agency just throwing stuff at a wall. They actually studied the issue a little bit. They are interested in hearing your comments. So argue for your customers' access. UPS and FedEx have said, we're done, unfortunately. Talk about how that is going to impact you if there's not reform of the B2B sales provisions. So USPS, this is a key thing. They can both follow the law. The law seems to indicate B2B, Congress wants it allowed, and help keep regulated retailers open. And that is it. We'll be back to me during the Q&A, but back to Paul. Thank you. Stop sharing my screen.
I'm glad that that was transcribed in case folks were reading along. We'll hand it over to Alex Clark now. Obviously, I'm sure most folks on this call or participating in this webinar are familiar with CASA, but certainly did want to hear from CASA about the consumer perspective on this, and certainly talk a little bit maybe about the tools that they've made available that can be used both by businesses and consumers to engage Congress and USPS during this process. So Alex, take it away.
Thanks, and thanks for putting all this together. I know people have a lot of questions, so hopefully we'll get to all of that, at least some of it. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Alex Clark. I'm the CEO of CASA. We are the oldest and largest consumer-based nonprofit advocacy group in the United States, arguably the world, dedicated to protecting access to reduced risk alternatives to smoking. And so, yeah, this has been a big issue for us, on our radar for at least a year, more than a year. Some may remember that we had an engagement up for, I think it was a Senate bill, was it 1253? Anyway, we're going to see it in a minute. But, you know, we are sort of continuing along, encouraging consumers to share their stories about how this affects them. And one of the big arguments that we've been putting forward is that by taking the ability of businesses to ship via USPS, there are many people across the country who are now being sort of left out in the cold. They don't live near a vape shop, or they live in a neighborhood where you know, maybe the private carriers don't deliver, and the businesses need the USPS to be that last mile delivery service. And so we're very concerned about those folks, and the fact that you know, they've depended on the mail in order to get their products for so many years, and now the closest retailer to them only sells cigarettes or some mediocre devices that they don't like. So that's one of the more immediate impacts there. The other thing, you know, we tend to spend a lot of time managing people's expectations. And so just to echo some of the points that have been brought up, you know, the probability of this becoming, or this rule changing this year is pretty low. And so our perspective is to look at this more on a longer timeline, and consumer comments are helping to provide that foundation for changing the law later on. So it really is very important. I don't want people to think that, you know, it's a dismissive thing to say that, you know, we're just going on the record. It might feel like that, but going on the record is vitally important for future reference. We have kind of picked apart the proposed rule more in line with what consumers should be looking for as far as points you will be addressing in your comments. And hopefully, you know, the business owners attending this can help communicate that to your customers. By all means, this is not just shameless self-promotion. Please promote our engagement to your customers. We've made this as easy as possible to get as much participation. And so just in case you haven't seen our updated website, we like to brag on this a little bit. Danielle Jones did a lot of work to make this as beautiful as possible. Under the Get Involved tab, nationally, you can see we've got both of our engagements up. So if you want a little bit of history about this, you can certainly check on the Keep Vape Mail Legal engagement. But the USPS vape mail ban comment, that's what we're going to be directing people to. We're doing our best to keep everybody updated on the status. Obviously, we know the comments are closing on March 22nd, and expect the final rule shortly thereafter. Here's a little, if you're into details and clicking on things, there's that. And of course, immediately you can go right into sending your message. And we have two things here. We want to make sure people do both of these. One is, of course, sending your comment to the USPS, and the other is reaching out to your lawmakers. Again, you know, by the time we come back, by the time Congress comes back to deal with this, maybe those lawmakers won't be around, but plenty of them will, and they need to be able to look back and see that we've been demanding some sort of change in this rule for a long time. But for anybody who wants a little bit more detailed breakdown of the points that we think are the appropriate for consumers to be addressing, we have them all laid out here. You can go back and read these at your own leisure. And of course, some frequently asked questions. I guess I'm more getting into kind of the pep talk part of this, where you know, a lot of consumers at this point, if you've been doing this for a while, you might feel like your voice doesn't matter. I saw some comments in the chat that people really are not listening to us. You know, for our part, the only answer to that is to get louder. Make sure that you are, as a business owner, whether you're manufacturing or you're selling direct to consumers, make sure that you're engaging your consumers on this issue. And please, I mean, get in a habit of that, because we're going to need all of your help engaging your customers going forward. We've needed it for 12 years. We're going to need it for 12 more. So with that, you know, it is really important for consumers to describe their experience, talk about why vapor products are so important to them, and certainly talk about the ways they are accustomed to receiving products. If you have people coming into your store who used to get the vape mail and now they can't, they need to talk about their experience. They need to talk about the extra miles that they're driving to come to your shop. They need to talk about how hard it is to get the product that they really wanted that helped them quit smoking. Again, I'm sort of echoing comments that have already been made, but specific to consumers, all of that is very important. And I think we do agree, you know, the USPS is looking at this. I sort of read their proposed rule as a polite way of speaking back to Congress and saying, hey, you guys don't really understand the industry that you're regulating, and you certainly don't understand the consumer's needs. And so as a consumer, feel free to throw that in there as well, as politely and calmly as you possibly can. So with that, I think everybody hopefully knows how to get to CASA.org and get to this engagement and share that with your customers. And if anybody has any specific needs or questions about the best ways to get that in front of your customers, I'm happy to talk with you about that. But I know that you're all business owners and you're all very creative in how you arrange your space, and I'm confident you can find ways to do this. And so please, by all means, do. And with that, I think I'll hand it back.
Cool. So we've gotten pretty quickly through sort of prepared remarks on these issues. And certainly I know that I think I got about 23 or so different questions. We'll get through, I think, many of them. And I know that some folks are submitting questions in the chat as well. So maybe we'll just dive in to some of the questions that we're getting. But first, because it's been mentioned a couple of times, I did want to cover this question of what exactly ENDS are, because this is not in the traditional sense how many on this webinar may understand ENDS as just e-cigarettes or vapor products that are perhaps those that contain nicotine. But Congress has sort of expanded the definition of ENDS. And yes, I'm going to be reading a little bit here, but I think it's informative for understanding sort of the broad nature what USPS is contemplating, and everyone has spoken to where USPS is looking for some guidance here, but there are a lot of outstanding questions. And I know that, we're focusing, I think, largely on sort of nicotine ends, but there's a sort of broader consequence. And I know that a lot of businesses are engaged in the CBD space, for example, or you may manufacture or sell devices that can be used for a wide range of liquid products. And those are or may be covered by limitations here. And so the way that Congress has defined USPS in terms of its limitation on ends is what they've said is that an electronic nicotine delivery system includes any electronic device through an aerosolized solution that delivers nicotine, flavor, or any other substance to the user inhaling from the device, and includes an e-cigarette, an e-hookah, an e-cigar, a vape pen, an advanced refillable personal vaporizer, an electronic pipe, any component, liquid, part, or accessory of a device described above, without regard to whether the component, liquid, part, or accessory is sold separately from the device, and one product that isn't approved by the FDA for cessation purposes. And so obviously the intent here is to limit the mailability of ends to consumers related to nicotine delivery systems. And USPS is looking for some guidance on that. And for those that do device sales or manufacturing or distribution, that's one area where again, USPS has asked for some input and guidance, because whether you're a consumer or you're a business, that these are products that can be used for non-nicotine liquids and non-nicotine products generally in terms of the device and hardware side of things. And so fortunately, Congress has somewhat attempted to limit the focus on nicotine products, because those are the ones, of course, regulated by the FDA, overseen by the FDA in terms of all the limitations that we're seeing in this space. But certainly worth examining that, because I know that it's a question that's arisen. And the reason that's an important issue is because there is a broader industry of folks that sell these products, that use these products. Again, even if you're a retailer and your intended adult consumer market is either current and former smokers, or adults that use these products for nicotine or non-nicotine vaping purposes, it is something that runs the risk of being limited, even if your intent is not to sell necessarily nicotine ends. And so I think that's certainly worth starting off as a conversation. Working our way through some of these questions. One question that came up was that USPS has an age verification system in place. There's a fixed cost that exists there for a wide range of products. I don't know if the number quoted we've got, what the price is. Someone said $6.70. But no one's acknowledging that USPS already has what they need to do something like a age verification system. So I know the answer to this, but maybe the question for panelists are, if USPS already has a age verification system in place for other products, why hasn't that been extended for delivery of these products to consumers?
So I will say that very briefly. The ID at Delivery 21 Plus was created by USPS and rolled out about a year after the original PACT Act passed. And so 10 years later, when myself and others were meeting with congressional staff and trying to explain potential amendments, the key thing on our mind was, why are we pushing this business to UPS and FedEx when USPS now has adult signature ID check on delivery? And unfortunately, the end response typically was, oh, you need to go get other sponsors from the other side of the aisle to agree to that. And of course, those agreements were not forthcoming. And that's when you end up with a bill with an extremely expansive definition that for some reason redefines us as cigarettes. They just took what they had and passed it. So that's one of our points. If you are someone who is being impacted by this, a retailer, a distributor, a manufacturer, talk to and ask to meet with, perhaps by Zoom due to the current environment, the district director for your Congress member. You'd be surprised, with rare exceptions, when it comes to strict business concerns, Congress members will listen, and it may not result in something happening tomorrow, but this kind of absurdity that USPS is shutting themselves out of a market that they themselves have adapted to, that's something that could get noticed.
We've got another question regarding implementation and limitations on this product or ends generally. And I think I'll lump this in with a question about what other providers are doing. And so as Greg pointed out at the beginning of his remarks, other common carriers have announced their own policies. Some are already in effect and some are going into effect within the next 3 weeks, that they're not only going to stop shipping ends to consumers, but carriers like FedEx and UPS have also said that broadly, they're no longer going to handle business to business shipments of products, perhaps with an exception process in place. And so, one of these questions is about whether there are alternatives to that. And so, without giving the answer to that, maybe we'll touch on that in a moment. But I think to Greg's point on assigning some folks some homework here as it relates to informing your comments. If you have information from the carriers that you use, or if you have information on regional carriers or alternatives that you've looked into as potential alternatives to your current shipping arrangements, whether you use USPS or some other common carrier, I think including that sort of information about what your higher costs are is something that could be a helpful case to be made to the USPS about the importance of preserving your right, as was the intent of the original PACT Act and the current PACT Act, for business to business shipping purposes under the business and regulatory purposes exception. And so those sorts of data points, if you're comfortable sharing them, I mean, obviously there are manufacturers or wholesalers who may not want to share that sort of information, but in particular, for example, if you're a vape shop and you've been using different carriers to receive products, or even if your wholesaler has used different carriers to deliver products, and you have some sense of what your costs are going to be, whether it's your shipping costs are going to go up 25% or they're going to go up 15%, or if it's more extreme than that. That's the sort of information I think is helpful in terms of providing a data point to USPS. And I know that Greg certainly had some conversations with some of these alternative carriers. And I would even invite some of these alternative carriers to what may be commonly used by many, both businesses on this webinar or elsewhere, to submit comments as well. And even if it isn't about your specific business model, even if it's about difficulty in logistics space, I think those sort of comments from carriers would be very, very helpful. Encouraging them to preserve the business-to-business regulatory purpose exception, while also explaining sort of the unique business model that exists in the delivery of these products, which are a lot different than the traditional tobacco, business-to-business shipping market, because they've got a lot different carriers. So I don't know if folks have additional comments on that, but certainly did want to bring that up. We have a question also that I think partially relates to comment period, but is also related to some questions I know businesses have. Are other common carriers creating their own exemptions? This goes to the point I just alluded to. Or does PACT Act also limit the ability of private common carriers to do business to consumer or business to business shipments? So anyone want to take a stab at that? Or I can.
I can handle it. We've seen a few common carriers step up, particularly for business to business, but also business to consumer, and say people that have experience dealing with special shipments, like guns, for instance, or pharmaceutical drugs. They have some existing networks in place, or companies that have relationships with existing networks. And for them, it's about making the finances work and getting their partners to recognize that the financing and the regulatory and the compliance can work. So the common carriers, private common carriers, they do have restrictions on them under this bill, but they're restrictions that if they want to be in this business. That's what they need to do. They will need to do for business to consumer the ID at delivery, and they will need to work with their businesses that they're shipping with to make sure that appropriate checking and record keeping is done. I have high hopes that as time goes on, the business to consumer side will be solved to an extent. There's one particular company that is working on starting off, I believe, April 1st in a few states in the Southwest, and then move on. But a lot of these companies, because of logistics involved, they're not interested in, yet at least, these small businesses that aren't shipping 300 to 500 packages per day or 300 to 500 packages every other day. So there's a lot of work to be done in this sector, but I have faith that American exceptionalism, that this will get solved to at least an extent.
I've got a question about the process for USPS exceptions and what the process looks like. And I think is an important question to address because it should inform some of the comments for those that are looking beyond this implementation of the rule, but then into compliance and figuring out how to navigate USPS if it is a provider that you choose to use. And so the question pointed out is that as part of the current PACT Act for exceptions under the business and regulatory purposes exception for business to business sales, you have to list all applicable state and federal licenses or permits that authorize the entity, your business, covered by the application for the exception to engage in the business. And you have to attach physically copies of all supporting documentation. And so if you're a large tobacco manufacturer, if you were to take advantage of this, that's onerous enough, but probably a little easier than if you're dealing with 500 different sort of entities in different states. And so I think this gets to one of Greg's 4 points earlier about the sort of comments that USPS would benefit from hearing from, which is that number one, this is not a process that is currently digitized, and that given the reality that all businesses in this space have to register everywhere, providing or creating a portal for the submission of information that would give you access to whether you've been approved or denied would be a very helpful endeavor for USPS to engage in, maybe in partnership with another agency. Obviously, there is information sharing that occurs between USPS and the DEA and ETF. And so they obviously have this sort of information. The question is why whatever their process for communicating it between each other can't be streamlined on the front end for your business. And so I think if that's a concern of your business, that is a fantastic, sort of substantive comment to provide to the USPS, which is the process as it exists right now requires physical copies of this information. Where do you want me to cut down 400 trees and print out all of the licenses and permits that businesses that I work with or we work with that exist in local jurisdictions, state jurisdictions, and now federally? Where do you want us to send that? And so streamlining that process, making it easier for the applicant to understand, and also for USPS to understand so that they have easy access to it, especially as they coordinate between agencies, when they begin doing things like enforcement or audits. And those are certainly conversations for another day, but it benefits USPS to streamline that process as well. And I think that is a great question to pose while outlining your concerns about it to USPS during the process.
And I'm going to clear out 4 questions from the Q&A fairly quickly. The first question, someone's asking about a vapor product that is not intended to be inhaled. Does that fit within the definition of ENDS or in the PACT Act? That's all going to depend on what a prosecutor or an ATF agent or a USPS agent, how they decide to look at it and whether you're going to spend $100,000 or more to defend yourself if that ever comes to it. Not a question that you can answer with any certainty. Another question, is a dry herb vaporizer impacted? Well, does a dry herb vaporizer, is it an electronic device that creates an aerosolized solution that delivers a substance, I think it would qualify. But again, that's a lawyer question. And I am here today as a mere advocate. Looking at the law, it looks like CBD and hemp products are not included. Well, again, if you look at the definition, just because electronic nicotine is in the name, as the USPS has acknowledged, it is a very broad definition where anything that is intended to be vaped, aerosolized, a liquid, a device intended to do that, that it seems to be included. But certainly you can note in your comments, you can advocate for this to only be applied against nicotine containing products or products intended to be used with nicotine. But with the definition that the USPS has, does not seem likely that they are just going to back off and restrict their intent so far. And the last, how is the USPS or PACT Act going to stop people from ordering their products from overseas? That is, if they need to, if the USPS or another agency wishes to go after the common carrier, that's how they will go after people. And you also have state tax authorities that could decide to seek out taxes on any product that you have brought into the country. The question of how the PACT Act is impacting importing products into America is one that is not something that I'm prepared to speak of. Maybe Michael or Paul knows a little bit more about importing into the US. I'm not sure if that's relevant to this conversation, but I know it's come up here.
I mean, I think, Greg, I agree with all that you just said. I mean, for imports coming in, they're using Postal Service for last mile delivery, which is a significant volume. I mean, particularly if the private carriers are not going to carry these products. And remember, the discipline on the private carriers and others who are importers or otherwise, or people who are intermediaries in the supply chain, is if they're found to be violating this, they'll be put on the Attorney General list as a company that's violating the PACT Act. There are civil and criminal liabilities. If they're submitting it to the Postal Service, there's also then False Claims Act liability for that. And so one of the issues, and this goes to the ambiguity you just raised on a number of other products also, if you have a question, seek clarity in the rulemaking. Now is the time to get it. You may get a bad answer, but I mean, just trusting your own interpretation, plowing forward, unless that's the only product that you sell. And even there, I think it's a risky strategy legally, but you run the risk if you're violating it and the Postal Service does open up a package, which may be low likelihood, but it's still a likelihood. You get put on the AG list, then you're a designated bad actor in the views of the prosecutors, which is not where you want to be. And so I think that's the discipline on importers. If they're importing into the Postal Service system for final delivery, they'll be subject to the same screen. Customs is the one that screens that for the Postal Service for any inbound shipments. They do regularly audit packages, especially from countries that are known to ship things they shouldn't. So think about, I mean, China, Mexico, other places where you have a lot of fentanyl, illegal drugs, other things coming through. They've got very rigorous enforcement for that. If the companies are found to be on that, what you don't want also is to have your name as the recipient address coming from an illegal shipment if it's being shipped direct to you. And so I think for all those reasons, you just need to be really careful about that in terms of how you're operating on it, because that is a list. It is still part of the enforcement regime, which is they keep an active list. And the Postal Service, when they're undertaking the verification, that's what they're doing. They're bouncing the information you give them in terms of the shipper and the recipient address off that AG list to see whether any of them are designated as bad actors.
And part of the complicated nature of this question is also the interplay between private carriers and USPS, which is obviously carriers like FedEx and UPS have announced broad prohibitions on business to business and business to consumer shipments. But we know that there may be an exception process. And so most of the answer to that question may come down to the conversations that importers are having with their current private provider, because obviously USPS, even if they're a receiver or shipper in the final mile or end conversation, you have to have a legal carrier that deals with it on the front end. And so some of those questions may come down to things that aren't necessarily subject to limitations during this rulemaking, but are impacted by it. And those may be FedEx or UPS or other carrier questions as well.
And another easy question for me to answer: can you submit your PACT application for business regulatory purposes exception now? No. It doesn't make too much sense that all of a sudden you're going to have a final rule come out and then you're expected to abide by the final rule while at the same time needing to submit all this paperwork and have someone go through it. But they're here from the government and they're here to help. Scariest words. That is the reality. You can't submit your application yet. They don't want them, as far as I know.
Yeah, and that being said, I mean, for those that are looking to put together or prepare, I think registration is the most important thing here, because that is a deadline that comes and goes before implementation of the shipping limitations on USPS handled packages. But we have what USPS has clearly announced is that their intent is to simply replicate the exception process that exists for traditional products, whether those are cigarettes and smokeless tobacco. And we know what that exception process looks like, and the basic questions that are on that one pager, and essentially the most onerous component of that application process is disclosing and providing all of the registration and permit information for all of the regulated businesses that you're dealing with. And so yeah, Greg's right, which is once the comment period closes and once the rule is made final, and I know that we had a question about when this becomes effective. Once that occurs, whether it's 1 week after the comment period closes or 3 weeks after the comment period closes, but not later than the last week of April, it is our hope that in the interim, before that becomes effective, that the exception process manifests itself in the way of a one-page application for exceptions. Again, we know what the original exception one-pager looks like in terms of filling that out and submitting it, and hopefully before enforcement begins and before implementation of limitations, that also exists. But yeah, Greg's right, which is they haven't announced what that application is, other than signaling that it will probably be almost identical to the original exception application for business-to-business sales.
And getting through a few more questions. Will the PACT Act cover synthetic nicotine? Not your lawyer, but it certainly appears so. Can we get somebody's asking about stores being required to keep a registry of its customers? Vape stores, doesn't this impacts you in terms of receiving B2B shipments, but vape stores, there is no registry of your customers required unless that is a state or local law. A good question from Jennifer Burton. Should we, and this is something that should be highlighted in your comments as well, I regret not including it as a fifth point. Should we expect a period where nothing will be shipping to include USPS? In other words, just as we were talking about, this law, this rule gets issued in its final form, and then 1,500 different manufacturers and distributors are going to be submitting applications. How are people going to be shipping their products in the interim? That is something to say in the comments, that we need some form of leeway from the time this becomes a final rule to the point where these applications are processed. Something needs to be done, or else when you combine that with, as you should note, DHL for domestic, FedEx and UPS no longer being in this business, could cause significant disruption to small businesses.
And to echo that point, this puts common carriers in a position of picking winners and losers, and USPS ambiguity, or a area of confusion about who may be accepted or what the exception process looks like, hands a lot of this market in terms of products that can be shipped to businesses and between businesses to private carriers who at present can simply pick who they may want to continue to do business with. And that was not the intent of Congress. Obviously, the intent of Congress was only to limit business to consumer sales as they existed, or as they exist today, but will have existed before April. And I think that is a helpful comment to provide if you have insight on any of the complexity of receiving an exception for the common carriers, but certainly want to echo the point that ambiguity from USPS hands a legal market that is regulated by the FDA to private carriers who are not in a position to maximize the market as the FDA goes through this approval process. And so I think that is a helpful point to explore, even if you don't necessarily have the answers, but pointing out that there is such uncertainty on the private carrier side of things that because it seems so clear that there is a protected business to business exception for shipments and sales between wholesalers, retailers, distributors, manufacturers, that makes even more important the ease of application and a lack of ambiguity before enforcement begins, so that everyone is equally treated that is in a similar situation.
And I'll go through a few more questions here. The definition of ends is broad enough to include nebulizers. Are they included? Well, there is an exception in the law for products that have approval through the FDA, and I would suspect nebulizer machines or go through some form. And even then, I doubt the manufacturers are too scared of being accused of selling an electronic nicotine delivery system, even though they may fall under technically. Does a PMTA approved product receive exemptions from these rules? No, unfortunately not. What about warranty items? How does business send warranty replacements to customers? Great thing to note in your comments.
Yeah.
Our plan within hopefully 48 hours or so of this webinar ending, we're going to send out an email with our final list of suggestions for B2B. B2C, that's CASA. CASA has their page on that. But warranty, being able to send products replacements back and forth for repairs, that absolutely should be in some of your comments. Paul, do you have any?
It does seem clear that consumer to business shipments, so say a return to a manufacturer, is protected under the current act, but certainly outlining the importance of that process, if you have any unique experience there as a business, would be helpful, because again, as folks know, unlike cigarettes, which no one returns, usually you just smoke them and throw the packet away, devices and liquids may be returned in some instances. And so if you're a business that has experience in receiving from a customer either a faulty product or return product for any reason, protecting that, again, it does seem that it is clearly protected now under the current act, but it is doubly important for PMTA purposes because these are products that are tracked and monitored, and any sort of information about faulty devices or faulty products is stuff that certainly you'll want to know as a manufacturer, especially if you're submitting additional information to the FDA for future PMTAs or the current PMTA. So it does appear that the consumer to business shipments are protected under this, but certainly if you have unique insight on that as a part of your business model, including that in your comment would be informative to the USPS and helpful.
And a few more. What exact day will USPS start enforcing the mail ban? We do not know, but the comment period closes March 22nd. They need to get the final rule out and make it non-mailable according to Congress by, April 27th or so, approximately. But it's likely to be earlier than that. And that's going to be part of the comments to USPS when the effective date is. We, at minimum, should have it be a little later, up to the point where Congress said it has to be in effect. That plus the questions about registration issues, the delays that are going to be natural for that. Retail stores, if you are a retail store who is just receiving products from licensed distributors, manufacturers, et cetera, that's their problem. Again, this is a compliance question, but I'm not speaking as your lawyer, but they are the ones responsible for getting you to send, if they want to go through the process to USPS of mailing products to you or go through a common carrier and register with the ATF, that is their responsibility. If you are just a retail store owner receiving products, the responsibility falls on the person mailing products to you.
And what I would say on that front, speaking on the non-retail side of things, get your information together though, because if you want to continue to get as many shipments as possible from approved businesses, those approved businesses are going to, in order to get approved, because the application will require them to submit information about your business being licensed and permitted in the local jurisdiction or the state where you have either a vapor license or a tobacco license or a general retail license, have all of that information and begin submitting it to the businesses that you work with or want to work with. Because in order for them to get on this list of approved USPS businesses, they're going to have the information to get you approved as a receiver. And so, yeah, Greg's right. It's on the shippers, side of things to handle that. But if you don't want any slowdown in terms of products coming into your store, make sure that you're prepared to provide all of your registration requirement, all of the state and local requirements in terms of your registration to the businesses that you work with, so that they can get you approved once that process is put in place.
And there are one question has come up several times about the rule of construction in regards to CBD. This rule states the amendments do not change the meaning of FDA law, ends products definition virtually the same. Why would an FDA law apply? Here's the thing. Unless you have 6 figures in your bank account and are ready and willing to step up and be a martyr in the federal court system, should this come along and they try to challenge your CBD business's right to ship products through the USPS to consumers, that's a risk you would need to take, to say, well, even though the law in the PACT Act now says that this broad definition of ends, that this somehow conflicts with FDA law, that is a risk you need to take. I don't know if Michael has any thoughts on this, if he's seen the question in the chat, but that is something that a private business, that's a decision they need to make with their attorneys. Michael.
No, I agree, Greg. I also think there's a separate question of whether or not you're subject to FDA jurisdiction and whether or not it's mailable under the Postal Services rules, which is a separate provision of Title 18 of the Criminal Code. And so whether or not it's subject to FDA jurisdiction, the law will be as soon as this goes into effect, but it's not mailable through the Postal Service unless you qualify for one of the exceptions. And only the Postal Service can tell you whether you qualify for one of the exceptions.
I think there's also been a question about registration with ATF. Consult the Jenkins Act, consult again the PACT Act. The registration requirements are outlined in the PACT Act and the Jenkins Act. It is different for every business, but this is something that you should be looking to address even before implementation of the USPS rules. That's the extent of my legal advice on that question.
And we have a question about, does this new rule affect components such as nicotine raw material? So very high strength nicotine intended for manufacturing. I do not know. That's one of the people can have different readings of different definitions and come to different conclusions. I don't know if Michael has a thought on that.
I don't know.
Yeah, unfortunately, the most honest answer to some of these very good and valid questions is we don't know. No ATF agent or anyone has answered that question, but it's something to include in the comments. Again, you may not like the answer, but it's important.
I would just say read the definition of the ends, and then if you've got questions or if you consult a lawyer and they've still got questions, I think that is a helpful bit of information to provide or a question to ask of the USPS in this process, because there is ambiguity. I mean, component parts, including liquids, are certainly outlined as ends, but for pharmaceutical purposes, nicotine can be used for other means too. So some of that question is going to come down to interpretation of regulated products versus whether it's in the tobacco space or other product space. But if you've got questions, certainly USPS isn't going to be able to answer all of them, but as it relates to the mailability of products, they may not respond to your questions, but having that on the record is something that is helpful.
So at this point, we're now 72 minutes into the webinar. If anyone has any final words, I'm glad to hear them, but you've all asked some really good questions. Some of the questions I think have been covered throughout it. There's a very broad definition. So if you are asking, is X included? The answer may in fact be yes, but the answer also could be, we don't know yet. There are new or existing shipping companies other than UPS and FedEx that are trying to compete for business from some businesses. I highly recommend, there's a group on Facebook. If you simply search Facebook for PACT Act, 2 words, there is a group, PACT Act, and the businesses that are competing for business, they've joined those groups to try and plug themselves. There's active discussions happening about what those companies are requiring. For importing from China, someone in the chat said that DHL Express is continuing to operate for international to domestic and then goes to USPS, and you still need to be in compliance at that point, presumably. And somebody added in the chat a link to that PACT Act group. Thank you very much. And as I said, the goal for myself, Paul, Michael, and others is within the next 48 hours or so, if you signed up for this webinar, you'll get hopefully a video of the webinar as well as a cheat sheet of what, based off of the conversations we've had today and in private, what should be, what you may want to include in your comment as a business. Paul or Michael or Alex, anything?
Yeah, I would just say that it's clear there's a lot of questions we don't have the answers to. And that's because all of these questions were not explored in the law. And some of them are still subject to interpretation, both by Congress, maybe by the courts. I think we had a recommendation 14 times in the chat at some point to sue someone, but certainly potentially by USPS as well. And so, you know, to Michael's earlier points, there's only so much that USPS can do with the law that they've been handed, but it's clear that some of the components of that law are ambiguous in nature. And so the question will become how USPS attempts to replicate the original PACT Act business-to-business exception, how they begin to enforce in the midst of these uncertain, you know, times with regard to how other common carriers are dealing with exiting the market or narrowing the market. And largely, I think the role of businesses and consumers or interested parties who are aligned with our interests as advocates here is to ask some of these questions while sharing your own business story. While also recognizing that UPS doesn't get to rewrite the law, that USPS can't simply say to Congress, no thanks. And so, you know, explain to them how important it is that your business continues to have access either to shipping these products to businesses or as a business, how having access to receiving these products is what is helpful here. And again, they've outlined that they've got some questions. You know, one issue we didn't touch on was consumer testing. You know, Michael talked about it a little bit, but if you're a manufacturer that's going through the PMTA process right now, USPS doesn't know about the PMTA process. They're not informed on the intricacies of the PMTA process. But being able to receive products back and being able to ship products between labs or the FDA are certainly things that USPS should want to protect, because in order for these products to have oversight and go through the review process, it may require USPS to be involved as a carrier. And so those are the sort of nuances that only you as individual businesses know about how important it is to have access to a carrier that ships and receives your products. And those are the sort of things that I think are helpful providing information to USPS during this process, with the recognition of what they're sort of obligated by law to do before the end of April. So I appreciate Greg for putting this on, appreciate everyone else for sharing their thoughts, and that's all I've got.
I would just say quickly, of course, echoing everything I think Paul just said, and I will, as is demonstrated here, yes, everyone has questions, and don't for a second think that they're too small or insignificant. The USPS is certainly not going to think of everything that they need in order to answer your questions. So by all means, ask them. And again, just another plug, whatever you do, please put resources in front of your customers so that they can participate in this. I'm partial to the call to action that we worked on and put up on our website, so I strongly recommend that. But however you can, please get your customers engaged. And thank you all for attending.
Any final inspirational words, Michael? Always go to the lawyer for the inspiration.
No, thanks for the opportunity to participate, Greg. I thought it was a good program. To Alex's point, I think, look, they do count heads, and I think there's independent value in the Postal Service reporting back that they received hundreds or thousands of comments on this, because it'll help, I think, persuade Congress then in the future that, you know, the definition really is expansive. There is some real ambiguity, and I think people, real businesses, are struggling to figure out how to comply with it. But there certainly are some what appear to be unintended consequences. So I think it's helpful just to have a lot of comments come in to raise some of these points. All great questions on the call. Happy to be part of the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you all. Again, thank you all for attending. And you will, if you signed up for the webinar, you'll receive some information. If you, whatever information I put out, I'm sure it will go on my Facebook as well as in the PACT Act Facebook group, as well as my Twitter account. So you'll hear about our final conclusions. Thank you again, and keep up the fight.
Thank you.